Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Alina Najwa binti Abdul Halim. I'm from Group 3, Section 3. Okay, today our group will present about analysis of international trade. International or global trade is an exchange of capital goods and services between different countries and territories. In 2018, the global trade value of goods exported throughout the world amounted to approximately 19.5 trillion US dollars. In comparison, this figure stood at around 6.45 trillion US dollars in 2002. So the rise in the value of goods exported around the world reflects developments in international trade, globalization, and advances in technology. The factors that affect international trade include endowments and productivity, trade policy, exchange rates, foreign currency reserves, inflation, and demand. Next, little introduction of trade war between US and China. China-United States trade war is an ongoing economic conflict between China and the United States. Ex-President Donald Trump in 2018 began setting tariffs and other trade barriers on China with the goal of forcing it to make changes to what the US says are unfair trade practice and intellectual property theft. The trade war has negatively impacted the economies of both the United States and China. In the United States, it has led to higher prices for consumers and financial difficulties for farmers. However, in China, the trade war contributed to a slowdown in the rate of economic and industrial output growth, which had already been on a decline. Many American companies have shifted supply chains to elsewhere in Asia, bringing fears that the trade war would lead to a US-China economic decoupling. In other countries, the trade war has also caused economic damage, though some countries have benefited from increased manufacturing to fill the gaps. It has also led to stock market instability. Governments around the world have taken steps to address some of the damage caused by the economic conflict. Okay, next, the leading importers and exporters of trade goods in the year of 2018. Okay, for the importers, we can see that the highest country that import goods around the world is United States with an amount of 2.6 trillion US dollars. Next, followed by China with 1.7 trillion US dollars, and the third largest importer is Germany, which is with 1.2 trillion US dollars. Next importer for the largest importers around the world, the first country is China with the total of 2.5 trillion US dollars, followed by United States 1.6 trillion, and lastly Germany with 1.5 trillion US dollars. We'll proceed with the list of the top 5 countries that have the most trade in terms of percentage of GDP. Okay, the first country is Hong Kong, which have the largest trade volume of 400%. Meanwhile, the second country is Luxembourg with around 398%, followed by Singapore, Ireland, and Maldives.
Assalamualaikum. So my name is Nur Dalila binti Azman. So the next point is, why do countries trade? So the first reason of why countries trade is because of the differences in technology. Advantageous trade can occur between countries if the countries differ in their technological abilities to produce goods and services. Technology refers to the techniques used to turn resources, for example, labor, capital, and land, into outputs, which are goods and services. We could also relate this with the comparative advantages model. Second reason why countries trade is because of the differences in resource endowment. Advantageous trade can occur between countries if the countries differ in their endowments of resources. Resource endowments refer to the skills and abilities of a country's workforce, the natural resources available within its borders, for example, minerals, farmland, and etc., and the sophistication of its capital stock. For example, machinery, infrastructure, communications, and communication systems. So the number 3 of reasons why countries trade is because of the differences in demand. Advantageous trade can occur between countries if demands or preferences differ between countries. Individuals in different countries may have different preferences or demands for various products. For example, Chinese are likely to demand more rice than Americans, even if consumers face the same price. Canadians may demand more beer, Dutch more wooden shoes, and the Japanese more fish than the Americans would, even if they all face the same price. This is largely because of the difference in the culture and customs of each country. So next, number 4, the reason why countries trade is because existence of economies of scale in production. The existence of economies of scale in production is sufficient to generate advantageous trade between two countries. Economies of scale refer to a production process in which production costs fall as the scale of production rises. Lastly, the reason why countries trade is because the existence of government policies. Government tax and subsidy programs alter the prices charged for goods and services. These changes can be sufficient to generate advantages in production of certain products. In these circumstances, advantageous trade may arise solely due to the differences in government policies across countries. So I'll pass the presentation to the next presenter.
Next, I am Nabiha, and will be presenting to you about real world trends. In the world in 2020, world trade is expected to fall between 13% and 32%. This includes world merchandise trade, which forecast to fall 9.2% in 2020. Next is global GDP, which will fall by 4.8% in 2020, but before rising by 4.9% in 2021. And the last one is world trade in commercial services, which plunged by a record 30% year-on-year in the second quarter of 2020. For the world merchandise trade, in the first quarter of 2020, which in January to March, the world merchandise trade volume decreased by 2% in the first quarter, and this is caused by the lockdown measures across the globe to fight the spread of COVID-19. In value terms, world exports and imports decreased at about 6.2% and 5.3% in year-on-year terms. All regions registered decline in 2020 Q1. For the world merchandise in the second quarter, which in April and June, world merchandise trade fell 14% in volume and 21% in value. And the third quarter, world merchandise trade volume increased by 11.6% from a deep second quarter slump. For the global GDP, real GDP market exchange rates decreased by 4.8% in 2020 compared to 2019 and expected to increase by 4.9% in 2021. For the service trade, it still declines and have still not improving, and recording significant declines again in October 2020. World trade in commercial services plunged by a record 30% year-on-year in the second quarter. This is the steepest contraction since the financial crisis in 2009.
I'm noise adaptive to the environment, which number is 2016-FO, and I will further discuss on strategies to increase net export, also focus on a few real-world example of issue related. Next. Besides the component of trade barriers and subsidies that we have studied in class, there are also measures taken by some countries to increase their net exports and have a balanced trade. So one of it is devaluing currency and trade agreements. So firstly, devaluing currency is making the currency of the country low intentionally. So how do countries lower their currency? They can either lower the interest rate, or the government can print more currency or buy foreign currency to make its value higher. So what did they benefit from having a low currency? Firstly, when the price is low, it will also make export price low in the foreign market. Exporters become more competitive in the global market, and thus export are more encouraged while import are discouraged. Import are discouraged because when the price of when the currency is low in one country, the price of import will become higher relatively. So thus, the people won't buy something that they can afford, or the price is too high. So next, let's move on to trade agreements. Trade agreements is agreements between two or more countries to ensure a regular flow of international trade. It is aimed at stimulating trade and supporting economic growth for both countries involved. For example, we have trade agreement of US and Japan, where Japan agrees to buy a certain amount of American-made automobiles in exchange for the US increasing its imports of Japanese rice. For the valuing currency, I forgot to mention earlier, countries that use these methods is Japan and China. So I will choose a real world example of Japan on how they boost their export. So Japan used the devaluing currency. Japan briefly became the largest holder of US debt in 2015 and also in 2017. Japan does this to keep the yen low relative to the dollar to improve its export. Japan is very popular for their low interest rate and also zero rate. The Bank of Japan strive to keep their interest rates low. So how they keep their interest rate low? They use quantitative easing method. Quantitative easing method is they continuously buying government debt, and thus this quantitative easing will increase the money supply in the country. When the money supply increase, it will keep the value of the country's currency low. And thus this make the country stocks more attractive to foreign investors. It also makes export less expensive. Next, Japan was the first country to use quantitative easing from 2001 to 2006. It also restarted back using quantitative easing in 2012 when Shinzo Abe became the Prime Minister of Japan. He promised to reform Japan economy with his Abenomics program. Japan, as mentioned earlier, Japan is very famous for their zero rate, or their interest rate is very low and near to zero. So when Japan's zero rate policy drove trillions of dollars Japan. For 20 years straight, Japan has been the world's biggest investor, and this much of this money has gone into stocks, real estate, bond from emerging market countries. Okay, next is I want to focus on Japan trade barriers. Did you know that it is hard for certain foreign product to enter Japanese market? It is due to Japanese high level of standard for foreign product to enter the market, and they also practice non-tariff barrier. And this non-tariff barrier mostly focus on protecting agriculture products like rice. And Japan protects their agriculture heavily. So non-tariff barrier took the form of it have many forms like quotas, numerical export controls, voluntary export restraint, and many more. So in Japan, they focus more on law, policy, and practice. Non-tariff barrier may impact commercial activity by possibly impeding or delaying the importation of foreign products into Japan.
My name is Nomaisara binti Abdul Muttalib. My metric number is 2019450. So today I'm going to talk about GATT and WTO. Next. So what is GATT? GATT is General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. It was the first multilateral free trade agreement. And GATT is to eliminate tariffs and also increase international trade. So the first objective of General Agreement on Tariff and Trade is to raise the standards of living and the progressive development of the economies of all contracting parties. So the second one is to eliminate harmful trade protectionism. So this is because trade protectionism is likely contributed to the 66% reduction of global trade during the Great Depression. So the final objective is to intend to boost economic recovery after World War II through reconstructing and liberalizing global trade. Next. So the basic history of GATT. GATT was the agreement between 23 countries. So China, India, Canada, USA, and New Zealand were among those countries who signed GATT. GATT was signed on 30 October 1947, but it took effect on 1948 and also grew out of Bretton Woods Agreement and it established along World Bank and International Monetary Fund. GATT was signed in Geneva, Switzerland, and General Agreement Tariff and Trade held 8 rounds of meetings from April 1947 until December 1993. So the role of GATT is to establish a set of standards to guide the contracting parties to participate in international trade practices. So GATT stipulated several of basic principles to conduct the contracting parties in international businesses such as general most favored nation treatment and general elimination of quantitative regulation. So every contracting parties should obey these basic principles when they were involved in trade relations. So the next one is reduce the tariff of the basis of mutual benefit. GATT's major contribution was to reduce of tariffs by sponsoring rounds of multilateral negotiation. By sponsoring the multilateral negotiations, there was a significant reduce of the tariff. And the third one is protected the benefits of the developing countries to a certain extent to international trade. So the last one is to act as the court of international trade. It is providing a platform for contracting parties to negotiate and talk to settle disputes in international trade. So, general agreement on tariffs and trade was needed to solve those disputes which could not solve by parties themselves. Next. So the pros and cons of GATT. The pros is to encourage international trade. And the second one is to reduce the likelihood of war. When more countries trade with each other, the less likely war becomes. And GATT also promotes world peace. And the last one is to improve communication. So the cons of a general agreement on tariff and trade is domestic industry may struggle to compete as low tariffs destroy some domestic industries, contributing to high unemployment in those sectors. Second one is exposes more of the world to risk within given the domestic industry. And the last one is governments need some level of control to an international agreement. So moving on to WTO. WTO is World Trade Organization, which is a global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. It is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers to conduct their businesses. So the first objective of the World Trade Organization is to set and enforce rules for international trade. Second one is to provide a forum for negotiating and monitoring further trade liberalization. And the third one is to help developing countries benefit fully from the global trading system. Fourth is to increase the transparency of decision-making processes. And the fifth one is to cooperate with other major international economic institutions involved in global economic management. So the last but not least is to resolve trade disputes. So basic history of WTO, it's after GATT, WTO replacing GATT on 1995 and also in Geneva, Switzerland. So the membership had grown from 23 to 128 countries in 1995. So the average tariff rate fell from around 22% in 1947 to around 5% in 1993. So WTO established by the final act of the Uruguay round of negotiation, which is the last round of meeting. So the role of WTO is, the first one is WTO members establish rules governing international trade and services. It is to adapt or changing the principles of international trade means reaching consensus among WTO members through a round of negotiation. The second one is to settle disputes between members. 400 complaints have been filed by WTO members, and WTO members may file complaints against other members who fail to abide by the principles of international trade. So WTO is to solve the disputes between members. The third one is regularly reviews the trade policies of its member. Reviews assess whether WTO members are abiding by WTO rules and measure the impact of their domestic policies on international trade. Last but not least is to provide training programs for government officials from developing countries. WTO currently spends about 35 million Swiss francs annually on this program. So the last part of my presentation is the pros and cons of World Trade Organization. So the first pros of WTO is free trade encourages greater competitiveness. So the second one is lower prices for consumers. When tariff was removed, so it enables us to buy cheaper import. And the third one is low of competitive advantage. And the cons of World Trade Organization is difficulty of making progress. Trade rounds have been slow and it's difficult to reach an agreement. The second one is ignore cultural and social factors. This is because the domination of multinational companies which reduce cultural diversity and tend to swamp local industries and firms. So the last one is the failure to reduce tariffs on agriculture, because both the US and Europe retain high tariffs on agriculture, and it will hurt farmers in developing economies who face tariff protection. That's all. Next.
So the last point in our presentation is the new opportunities and challenges in international trading. Next. So firstly, in the situation of COVID-19, this global pandemic opens up various opportunities for the medical and health industry. We can see from the first product, which is face masks. In May 2020, China exported more face masks than any product. It is a few billions more than China's best monthly exports on its traditionally strongest products, which are laptop and cell phone. So wearing masks outside of the house is now an obligation for all countries all around the world. Moreover, it is a wear and tear product, so it is very highly demanded and needed at a large scale in every country in the world. Hence, that explains why China's trading activity in face masks is escalating in 2020. So the next example is medical latex hand glove. So this is particularly happened in Malaysia. According to Bloomberg Business Week, Malaysia is the world's largest source of medical gloves with a market share at about 65%. So according to the Malaysian Rubber Glove Association, Malaysia could export as high as 240 billion of glove pieces this year. There are a surge of demand from the healthcare workers and even the police in the US and the Europe. So the next example is vaccine. The vaccine for COVID-19 is widely purchased around the world. The demand and supply will escalate very quickly soon when the effectiveness of the vaccine is highly proven. So apart from the opportunities, there are also challenges in international trading when this COVID-19 happened. So the countries experiencing lockdown, the borders are closed, hence making international trading progress slower. Next, other trading products such as garment exports, for instance, apparel and footwear exports from China, is declining very sharply this year. This is because during this pandemic, people prioritize the essential goods such as food and medicines. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, 130 million more people living in extreme poverty due to the crisis. So the consumption of the people is narrowed more to the basic necessities, which is food and medicines. Lastly, the very high unemployment rate causing people not receiving any income, thus they will intend to buy local goods than the imported goods. This is because generally the local goods are lower in price than the imported goods. Moreover, during this pandemic, people are more supportive towards local businesses to elevate the country's economy. Next situation now is the climate change. So the climate change is the long-term alteration of temperature and typical weather patterns in a place. Climate change could refer to a particular location or the planet as a whole. Climate change may cause weather patterns to be less predictable. The results of climate change are, for instance, global warming and sea level rising. So from the climate change, the opportunities open for the countries who have the suitable resources to produce, firstly, energy efficient technology, and secondly, medical vaccine. Energy efficient technology is the technology such as electric car that helps reduce carbon emission from burning fossil fuel. However, this technology is usually higher in price, so the demand for the technology is lower compared to other products. So in medical or vaccine, extreme weather events can exacerbate infectious diseases, hence medical supplies and vaccines are needed. So the country that produce medical or vaccine products have the higher opportunity to trade the products to other countries who needed them. That's all. I pass to the next presenter.
Next, we move on to trade wars of USA versus China. So what happened actually? America declares trade wars with China by imposing tariff on Chinese imports. Why did they do that? It is because they want to reduce the trade deficit and to limit the US technology transfers to Chinese companies. So the trade deficit of USA to China is export at 120 billion, mainly on commercial aircraft, machinery, optical and medical instruments and vehicles, and imports. They import 450 billion, which the components of computers, cell phones, and apparel. And the deficit from the trade is 490 billion. So the timeline of these trade wars is, firstly, the Trump administration has imposed strict tariffs on a total of 250 billion in Chinese imports. Next, on May 10, 2016, Trump imposed a fourth tariff. He raised tariff to 25% on $200 billion worth of goods. On June 1st, 2016 and 2019, China retaliated with a 25% tariff on $60 billion of US goods. On August 13, 2019, Trump threatened a 10% tariff on Chinese electronics and clothing, and many more to come. So how does these trade wars affect the people? So in short run, it will increase the price of consumer goods import, such as in America, the price of steel and aluminum will increase because they import it from China. And next, uh, in short run, it will limit the consumer choices as price keep on increasing. For example, the price of cars from China increase, so they don't have many choice to pick the goods and services. And the third short run effect is when the price of import become larger in the country, the firm have to cut costs and lay off workers to remain competitively priced. So in the long run, firstly, it will slow the economic growth of the country. It will create more layoffs, especially in the export industry. And the last one is it will weaken the domestic industry as there are no competition from the other countries and such they don't have any innovative because no competition.
Okay, next is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or In short, we can call it RCEP. RCEP and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or in short we can call it CPTPP, are the only major multilateral free trade agreements signed in the Trump era. RCEP was signed on 15 November 2020, and it includes 15 countries around the world, including the Asian members and the 5 regional countries. It is the largest free trade agreement in history and dominated by the East Asian members. Okay, for the economic significance, as this RCEP was signed, RCEP could add $209 billion annually to world incomes and $500 billion to world trade by 2030. Second, of economic significance that estimated to happen is RCEP and CPTPP also is estimated to together offset global losses from the US-China trade war, although not for China and the United States. Last but not least, RCEP and CPTPP will make the economies of North and Southeast Asia more efficient, linking their strengths in technology, manufacturing, agriculture, and natural resources. So in the next pictures, that there are also Malaysia included in the participating countries of the RCEP and CPTPP. Okay, that's all from us. Thank you.